Hello, I'm Harold Munro, Editor-in-Chief at the Vancouver Sun and Province, joined by our City Hall columnist, Dan Fumano. Hi, Dan. Got a busy week ahead of you,
Yeah, yeah. There's a couple
as
of
always.
conferences, lots going on.
Right. Lots around housing. But last week, you wrote a couple of very interesting stories. I thought the piece about the hiring of the nurses, we know that the incoming ABC council, a year plus ago, promised to hire 100 nurses during the election campaign. So this was, I guess, a bit of an assessment of how that program is going and how far down the road they are in that regard. So what did you hear last week?
So essentially, yeah, what it was an update, a presentation for council's information about how this is going, the sort of the partnering of these psychiatric nurses with Vancouver Police, and also a request for more money because essentially what the city of Vancouver doesn't employ any nurses, right? But obviously this was a big campaign promise from ABC to hire 100 more police officers, 100 nurses. Police officers, of course, the police department is the biggest part of the city's budget. So that's, within council's purview. The hiring of nurses is a little bit different. So because the city doesn't employ any nurses, so what this amounts to is council sending money to the provincially funded Vancouver Coastal Health, the local health authority. So it amounts to an operating grant. It's like city council sending millions of dollars in grants to Coastal Health to hire the nurses. So last week was, asking for council to approve the grant funding for the coming year, and also providing an update with how it's going so far. So they are still sort of in the process of staffing up and trying to recruit and hire more nurses. It's what we heard from Coastal Health is it's not easy, and they're trying to find the right people for these roles. But they're quite happy with the way it's going because it's a relatively new thing, and they don't want to just hire 100 people overnight and have it not work out. They're ramping up, and so they're happy with the way the hiring is going, even though they have had some questions. People saying, why was it so much easier to hire the cops than the nurses? But Coastal Health says from their point of view, it's a natural kind of ramping up. And the thing that stood out to us as being interesting was part of the presentation. They talked about different sort of initiatives. They've got these de-escalation kind of units that are out there trying to de-escalate mental health crises. But then they've also got nurses that are embedded within the Vancouver Police, what they call the Operations Command Center, which it's like the dispatch center. And they've got nurses right in there in the command center embedded with the police, triaging calls that have a sort of mental health component to them. And so basically between June of last year and January, those nurses handled a little less than 1,400 mental health emergency calls. And the thing that was significant was that a little more than half of those, 54%, so 743 calls, were basically either resolved by the nurse or diverted to a different non-police response. So you had hundreds of cases where police officers didn't need to respond to these mental health emergencies. So that was hailed as good news by Vancouver Coastal Health and by the Vancouver Police Department. You had a deputy chief from the VPD there, Deputy Chief Fiona Wilson, who was saying she thinks that's an incredible result. It's still kind of early days, but everyone's very encouraged by this result, that you're having a lot of situations where police don't need to be showing up to these mental health calls, which is good for police resourcing. But in the words of Deputy Chief Wilson, she said, this is good for the police resourcing if we don't need to show up to as many calls. They've got a lot of other calls they're dealing with. But it's also good for the people on the other end of these calls if they're getting a more appropriate kind of health-based response, as opposed to having police with guns show up.
Right, which is dangerous. That's dangerous for all.
It can be dangerous for everyone. It's in some situations it's needed, right? Obviously, in almost half of the calls, they did determine that police officers were the appropriate response. But it's obviously a pretty significant portion of these mental health calls. They have determined that police are maybe not the best or most appropriate person to be handling these calls. So obviously it's still early, lots more to do, but they, that was hailed as very welcome news by the mayor and council, the police department, and coastal health,
Okay. Well, that
and city staff.
sounds like it's a big number in terms of mental health responses, but it's a relatively small number in terms of, I guess, the total number of calls that police respond to. So it's not
Yeah.
going to allow them necessarily to reduce the number of police.
Oh,
This program.
no, we weren't hearing anything like that. But I think,
Okay.
it might, uh, I guess the idea is that it could reduce the number of calls that police are dealing with. But yes, no, it's a relatively small number in terms of the overall call volume that the police department gets. They get a lot of calls, but if there's hundreds of those over a period of a few months that they don't need to respond to, I think they they see that as being valuable.
Well, it's interesting that the incoming mayor, Ken Sim, did criticize the outgoing mayor for sticking his oar into areas of responsibility that were not local government responsibility. And of course, he created a review, sort of a forensic audit around what the city should and shouldn't be spending money on, and they recommended core issues. So, how did they justify this expenditure, which is arguably a provincial government expenditure, not a local government expenditure? How do they justify that?
I mean, essentially, because that question came up. This is the first time anyone I talked to can remember the city of Vancouver shipping millions of dollars, just cutting checks to fund sort of upstream to a provincially, you know,
Hmm.
funded body like Vancouver Coastal Health, providing healthcare services, which is clearly a provincial mandate. It's the first time anyone can remember the city council just sending money upstream like that. But nobody was saying, no one I talked to was saying they shouldn't do it. And essentially, yeah, when you talk to the ABC councilors, and this initiative is supported by the non-ABC councilors, they're essentially saying we're getting good results with this. This is what we want to see. It's people voted in favor of, ABC got a really strong mandate from the public, and this hiring cops and nurses was a huge part of their platform. It was one of the most high profile promises they made. Voters seemed to want it. So they're essentially saying they're responding to what was kind of deemed to be a mental health and public safety, public disorder, crime kind of crisis. Public safety was a big issue, top of mind in the election. So even though it's not traditionally the city's responsibility, they are responding to what they see as a need out there. And now they see it as their job to try to convince the province to fund this, to take it
Right,
off
I
the
did
city's
see
plate.
that. I did see that in your reporting, that there were
Yeah.
some
So
people, some officials as well as counselors who thought that this will be so successful that they'll be able to upload the costs to the province. But I can't think of an example of where a municipality has successfully uploaded a cost to the
yeah,
province.
so that's the hope. The expression that was used a couple of times in last week's meeting was proof of concept, saying we funded this, we've ponied up, footed the cost, footed the bill to get this thing up and running, to prove that it works. But we maybe can't, the cities maybe can't or won't afford to fund it forever. So I guess they're going to try to make the case that the province should be the ones funding it. But of course, yeah, that I don't know how that argument will be received by the province. And of course, once something is up and running, and if you're making the case that it's working well and getting good results, difficult thing to then cut the funding for it later. I don't know.
Hmm. All right. All right, Dan. Well, thanks.
Great.
Enjoy your week. I think you're going to talk a lot about, or you're going to be at a lot of housing events this week,
Yes.
municipal led as well as industry led.
Yes.
And you're going to hear from what the provincial housing minister, the federal housing minister. So maybe next Monday we can talk a little bit about, yeah, what you learned. That's always an issue that people want to talk about. So,
Yes. I think we're going to hear lots and lots about housing later this week.
all right. Best of luck with that. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Harold. Thank you.